So, hi everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Benedetta Carnaghi. I'm an assistant professor of modern European history at the University of South Florida.
wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much. Of course, I'm in Guadalajara, and I know because of our earlier conversation and other information that you've actually been here.
I have been here, actually there, sorry, for the wonderful book fair in December, and it was an incredible experience. It was my first time in Mexico. I was extremely touched by the generosity and the welcome of the Mexicans. I think there's a real kinship between Italians and Mexicans. So it was really, really quite incredible how they welcomed us. They took us around and they didn't leave us a second. And they had us taste excellent food, mind you, which is really a way to get the Italians.
Get the
So
Italian's heart. The
yeah.
Feria Internacional del Libro is on every year here in December, the International Book Fair. And it really is wonderful. And one of the things you must have noticed, Prof, is that school children arrive in their thousands once they get out of school and they sit down on the ground and they read books.
They do, and they attended our lecture, which was, incredible because I thought, it's huge, right? As you said, is a very large book fair. And so I thought, we'll be in a small room with three kind old ladies that decided to attend, and we'll try to, engage their attention. It was a huge lecture hall, probably the biggest I've ever been in. And we were, up on a stage and we received tons of questions and people even apologized for walking in late, but said late. We were listening to the live stream. And so I was like, wow, can you guys come to the US and tell our students that we are somewhat interesting and they should do that?
Really fantastic. Now, Prof, I've got a query that I pose to people to begin. But before I do, I want to ask about the two illustrations that are above your right shoulder on the wall of where you are. Now, I don't know. Oh, there are more. There are four.
Yeah, so you
Um,
might find me not prepared because I'm in an Airbnb, but I think these
oh,
are different
okay.
sides of Italy actually. So, because we are in Rome, this is clearly Rome. This is Piazza del Popolo in Rome.
Right.
So I don't know if I'm showing it correctly,
Yeah, yeah,
but you
yeah.
should be able to see
Beautiful.
that. And here, I wonder this could be Venice
It could
because
well
we
be.
see, gondolas and a canal
Yeah,
and, nice waterways.
yeah.
So I
Fantastic.
guess our kind Airbnb host thought that she should give us some views of Italy to inspire, people to come
Absolutely.
back.
And this standard question that I pose to folks now, Prof, is to inquire as to what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for Prof. Carnaghi?
What is going on from Prof. Carnaghi? So, I'm really lucky because I have a nice, long summer that I can spend with research and also, visiting my family because I take advantage of that when I have a few days. And so I'm in Rome for that reason. But I'm also slightly preoccupied by the political situation, not just of Italy and the United States, but in general, the fact that the far right is on the rise, the right is on the rise, right? And I'm trying to approach this, and I mean this literally, with humor. So
Mm,
I've decided that my current project is about humor as a tool of resistance. And of course, I look at the period of the Second World War and at humor specifically as a tool of resistance against the fascist leaders during the war. But this has a lot of contemporary connections, and it started during COVID, because I think during COVID we were all somewhat, stuck in the doom and gloom of the situation. And I specifically was stuck in the United States 13 months without being able to go back to Italy because of the travel ban. So we were told, if you leave the States, you might not be able to go back. And so I taught a course about laughter in hell, surviving through humor in times of war. And this was good for the students because the students were, a little depressed. They were social distancing. They had to take their classes online. And I think for first year students and last year students, it was terrible, right? Because you want to socialize when you arrive at the university and you want to, have a nice graduation party when you finish. And those were out of the question. Same for me, I graduated during COVID, so that nice big trip to the United States that I had envisioned for my family and friends didn't really happen. We had a Zoom party, but that's not really a lot of fun, I mean, I
Mm.
think silver lining, more people could attend that if I had invited them in person, but still, it wasn't what I had imagined. And that really got me thinking. And I thought we were all exchanging memes, related to COVID regulations. So humor was a really important factor. And so I started thinking, I'm like, I studied the Second World War, which is a heavy period, and I look at a lot of violence and political violence specifically. How can I make that less harrowing? And I thought humor is a form of resistance. I kind of want to see that. So
Mhm.
this is what has been occupying me at the moment, and specifically today because I just returned from a trip to the archives. So I went to the Central Archives of the State in Rome, which are, so I don't know if you've ever been to Rome. They are in the Eur, this neighborhood, which is very fascist. It's full of fascist building, and the archives itself, it's this big fascist building, which is can currently undergoing renovation. But I think you get there and you immediately see that you are in this part of Rome. So it's an interesting, experience to go there. And I went there because I wanted to look at some files of the Casellario Politico Centrale, which is where the fascists would, record all the subversive, as they call them. So all the people who were
Yeah.
against fascism, anti-fascism, abroad, both in Italy and abroad, and they were, monitoring them carefully and compiling these files. And these files are now stuck there and up for grabs. So it's interesting to go there. And so I was looking at people who were actually arrested because they told jokes against Mussolini or jokes against the leader, or because they had emigrated to London and they were working for the BBC and for this specific section called Radio Londra, broadcasting to Italy, and trying to convince the Italians that fascism wasn't so great and they should change their minds. And some could pick those up and listen to those programs and enjoy them. And I don't know if they changed people's minds yet, but I think they were quite funny and they were quite convincing. So yeah, so I wanted to tap into those files. So this was a very long-winded answers, but I guess it's politics and humor, or humor as a tool of resistance, that preoccupies me right now.
No, I think that's wonderful. And of course, humor has long been part of Italian political culture, actually. Not
It
just in the fascist period, but if you think about some of the populism prior to Meloni that was successful over the last 20 years, it had a very humorous component, no?
it does, yeah. And I think we have to be careful because it's not just a tool of the left, it's not just an instrument of resistance to right-wing rhetoric or the far right. I think Meloni herself is quite skilled in using it. I don't know if you've ever picked up on this, but there was, this song made out of bits of her speeches. You can find this on YouTube, because she keeps saying, "I'm a mother, I am a Christian," and genitore uno, genitore due, because she's accused of, her anti-LGBT politics. And very skillfully, I have to say, she embraced this because it was quite a catchy tune. So I think that was an instance where it sort of backfired because it played to her propaganda, and rhetoric. But uh, I think it's really interesting to observe, and it's lovely to spend your life looking at cartoons that were published on newspapers. So it's always nice to pick up a copy of the Repubblica and look at the cartoons or any other newspapers and sort of like see how you can filter through satire, right? So you can tell a lot through a very very concise cartoon. So I
She's
guess
got
I guess
such
it's my silver lining right now.
She has such distinctive features that she must be a classic for cartoonists,
She is, and
caricatures.
also she plays with it again because so her name means melons, right? So of course that's something that she told jokes about. Very good. I don't know how we can put that into words for our listeners, but I think if they go on Instagram, they see that she's embraced the melons, showcased the melons,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
uh, good tactic, I have to say. Yeah.
This is one of those things where the politics of spectacle that a lot of us thought of as being the province of the cultural left has actually been successfully appropriated by the cultural right. But can we get back to the second book project? Let's talk about the second book project and then go back to the first. Picking
Okay.
up on
Yeah.
this theme that you've introduced to us of making fun of fascism, because you've looked at this in the past, humor against the leader cult in these three key countries during the war. For people of my generation, Prof, the war only means one thing, Second World War. And you look at three of the key countries, France, Italy, Germany, where resistance of any kind was something that subjected those involved to intense peril, be it writing, drawing, filming, talking, be it sabotage, any of those things. So what sort of climate was there over the 20-year period you look at is actually not just the war, it's the rise of fascism in Italy through to the end of the war. So it's
Right.
almost quarter of
Right.
a century. And during that period in Italy, which became a model for this fascism, there was a big change, a change specifically that was anti-Semitic, amongst other things,
Right. Right.
and
Yeah.
that saw the harnessing of elite theory, Pareto, Gentile,
Mm,
etc., into the service of fascism when it wasn't initially exactly that. So,
right.
can you give us, perhaps starting out with Italy, a bit of a sense of what happens over those 23 years, and
Yeah.
also how
Yeah.
resistance takes the form of humor?
Yeah, yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I should tell you is how I stumbled into this, right? Because of course there was the interest, which was generated, as I said, by COVID and me teaching something about it. So a couple of instances for you. First is that because I worked on spies and court trials, so that was the first project, right? I was looking at a lot of court trials and I was more interested in the spies behind them, right? So who generated the trials in the first place, who was doing the spying on the anti-fascists, et cetera, et cetera. But the big surprise was that some of these anti-fascists, so to speak, because I think we have to have a conversation about when humor is actual resistance, right? And when it's just venting, sort of like the release of pent-up anger. Not everything is resistance, and I think the historians are constantly debating on where to draw the line, right? But tons of people who were arrested and had paperwork drawn on them because of jokes, telling jokes, just getting out and going to the latrines and writing something against Mussolini on the walls, or cracking a joke to a neighbor who's a bit nosy and then decides to report this, or this really stupid instances. And the paperwork, again, the amount of paperwork that's generated by this, and the prefects' reports on this. So the prefetti, these figures, were the ones who were supposed to collect all these denunciations and reports and then file them. And it's tons and tons of paperwork, Toby. So I asked myself, you know, didn't they have anything better to do? Especially with the war coming up, right? I think it's telling. It gives you a sense of the concern that the dictatorship or the regime before becoming a dictatorship has for the propaganda that's built around the cult of the leader. It's really important. The leader should be preserved and protected because, in Mussolini's case, but even in the other cases that you cited, is this man of providence that is supposed to bring up security and prosperity to the state. So the propaganda and the image of the leader should remain intact. Anything that goes against it is considered to be a threat. And, this surprised me enormously again, because it's hard to keep a leash on the state, and I think that there are other pressing needs than just prosecuting the people who are pissed off at the regime and crack a joke against the leader. So that's one thing. The other thing was that I had worked on the Holocaust and I had interviewed Holocaust survivors. And I swear to God, the last thing I expected was for them to talk to me about the importance of humor. Humor as a tool of survival in concentration camps. Here I'm going in a very different direction, but I'm just giving you the extremes, right? So I was interviewing this brilliant survivor of the Ravensbrück concentration camp, Simone Gournay, just outside of Paris. And I was there again to ask her about spies because she was arrested because of a spy, and deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp because she was a member of the French resistance network. So she was a political deportee. She was not a Jewish deportee, but she was part of this group of political prisoners. And she told me, look, if we didn't crack a laugh, we would not have survived. And she told me this incredible story. She said, I was deported with the French resistance members, but then, you were tasked with hard work in the camp. And sometimes you would end up part of a group of foreign speakers, like speakers of a language that you didn't really master. You just had to work with them. You had to find a way to understand what they were doing. And she was lifting this heavy weights and putting them on a cart, and they were counting. So I guess they were counting in Russian or Ukrainian. It was a Slavic language. She couldn't really pinpoint to which language it was, but it wasn't French. And so then at night, she would return to the barracks and fall asleep because she was exhausted. And in the morning, her compatriots, so the fellow French women who were there with her in the barracks, would say, look, there's a thief who comes at night. We hear her. She speaks a foreign language. It's got to be Russian, probably Ukrainian. And she comes every night, and we're really concerned. So I think we should stand guard because, any little thing that they had, a little bit of bread that they had smuggled or some possession that they had smuggled was at risk of being stolen. In the concentration camp is really any little bit that you have left, it becomes something important. And she's like, look, I would love to stand guard, but I can't. I'm just too exhausted. I can't. I have to sleep. And so 2 nights pass, 3 nights pass. And after 3 nights, her friends come and see her again. And it's like, look, Simone, sorry, that was a false alarm. It's you. It's
Ah,
you at night. I'm so tired that you repeat, you count in this weird language. We don't know what it is, if it's Russian or if it's Ukrainian, but you count at night. And we thought it was a thief coming, but it's you. So, this is harrowing to me. It's not really funny, but they laughed for hours about this, about her sort of like sleep talking, and it was just one of the many instances that they told me was really a survival tool, was really what the Nazis couldn't take from them, right? Because you can take somebody's humor and you can take somebody's intellect. So these were 2 instances that really sort of like made me think about resistance. And I know I'm not really answering your question directly, but I'm taking it very, very far away. But just to give you a sense, right,
yeah,
of how
sure.
I
And
arrived at
it's
this.
interesting, actually, when I think about Jewish humor, as I've experienced it, it has so much in common with Mexican humor, and to a certain extent, the better sides of British humor. Extraordinary self-ironization, self-mockery, laughing at things that are awful. And in the United States, people are mostly not like that. They're
You
terribly
know,
imitative. They're very, very literal minded.
Probably. Well, it depends. It depends where you go, right? It depends which groups you're part of. But yes, and so I started seeing connections, I guess, right? Because
Mhm.
I started with Italy, but so all these files compiled of people who were accused of offending the Duce are part of an actual crime. So the crime is offesa al duce, so offense to the duce, right? That's how it's labeled and heavily sanctioned. And there's a direct crime in Vichy France, so offense au outrage au chef de l'État, so against Pétain. Although Pétain is not the only one they make fun of, because they make fun of the other men of the Vichy regime, right? The Admiral Darlan, Laval, who's the head of the government, et cetera, et cetera. So it's interesting how they direct this at the leader, right? So I started thinking this is a way of undoing that propaganda that's built around the cult of the
Yes.
leader, which takes different forms, because in France it's this whole idea of travail, famille, et patrie, right? So the slogan of the Vichy revolution, so to speak, how Pétain calls it. And similarly in Nazi Germany, where I guess it's the extreme example. I thought too dangerous to make fun of Hitler. Who makes fun of Hitler? And yet there's a book by Rudolf Herzog on this very topic, and so you can find it. Is called Das Schwein ist tot, so the pig is dead, right? And all these jokes, around Hitler. And I also have to draw distinctions because, of course, as I expected, cracking jokes as fascist leaders inside the country, right, of the fascist regime is dangerous, is very dangerous. And of course, some of them are heavily prosecuted. There are cases where they do, an about turn, right? They switch because they're trying to save their lives or because they've been subjected to such violence that they're trying to, reverse the course of actions. And so I was looking just recently at the archives, the case of this anti-fascist satirical newspaper called Il Becco Giallo, which was, very effective in making fun of all the initial years of the fascist regime, say 1924, 1925, until when Alberto Giannini, who's the founder, he's heavily persecuted. They beat him up. They destroy the offices of the newspaper. They destroy his home, etc., etc. And he escapes to France, so he goes into exile. And there he switches and founds a fascist satirical newspaper called Il Merlo. So I thought this was an insane case of somebody who starts, staunch anti-fascist, sort of like really, really puncturing the regime propaganda, because I think those cartoons are extremely effective. I was just looking at them and I presented them in conferences and I used them for teaching. And, the students laugh with me because they really say things that we say now, right, in description of aspects of the fascist regime, moments of the fascist regime, and then suddenly turns. And he even explains why, right? So he says, I've been disappointed essentially by the milieu of the anti-fascists abroad. It's stale. They are only critical. They don't propose any solution, any alternative. And so I find myself suddenly against my country. I don't want to be against my country. So he has this lengthy explanation as to why switch gears. But I think this explanation doesn't really stand, especially because the anti-fascists abroad did come up with alternatives. They, in fact, are at the origin of the European Union, right? This whole idea of the Federation of Europe to avoid another totalitarianism, to avoid something like fascist Italy and Nazi Germany from returning, comes from that environment, right? Comes from the Manifesto di Ventotene, Ernesto Rossi, Altiero Spinelli, all these alternatives that they proposed, thinking really how we can prevent that from happening again. And so I think, there were productive discussions. He wasn't just critical, but it's interesting that somebody like him who had
Made that
started.
shift. But this is something that actually did happen in the 30s and into the war. People were switching sides. Mitterrand, socialist president in the 80s and early 90s, celebrated figure of the Marquis, was a fascist in the late 30s before he went
Right,
left. Paul de Man, celebrated figure of deconstruction at Yale in the 70s, wrote collaborative journalism in Belgium during the occupation. P.G. Wodehouse, celebrated English
right,
satirist, the
right.
same. So categories that today seem as though they are impermeable were more permeable then. This is not to give a free pass to these bastards. I'll have none of that. But it is to say that the sort of switch you're describing, although normally within an occupied country, did happen.
It did. It
People were
did.
trying
Yeah.
to survive. I don't justify it, but it did occur. It's not
But it did
completely
occur. Yeah,
unheard.
no, you're
Is that fair
absolutely
to
right.
say, do you think? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely fair. Which is why, yeah, as I was saying, I'm trying to establish some distinctions, right? So
right.
one, chapter will also be about the BBC group of exiles, right, anti-fascists
Yeah,
who have
yeah.
emigrated to London and then started broadcasting this humor through the airwaves of the BBC. And of course, those were not at the risk of being arrested. And so they had, you know, less qualms as to how to make fun of Mussolini and Hitler and Vichy propaganda. And so in that case, I think it was really effective. It was really, really quite effective. And it's great because if you go to the BBC archives in Reading, you can see the scripts of these satirical
Oh, how
programs that they came
wonderful. I
up
was
with.
going to say, is there any audio or is it all it's
Well, so I've only looked at the scripts. I've not really asked for audio. I don't know if it's possible to access. It would be great, right?
yeah.
Because it would be so much better to actually listen to the audio. I don't know. I think it's a fair question. But I started with the scripts, and boy, are they funny, even to us, because
Are they?
I
That
think
was my
there's a distance,
question.
right?
Are they
The
still funny?
issue I think, of humor is that humor, I mean, you are a specialist of cultural studies and cultural history, so you get this, it's very specific, very context specific,
Yeah.
right? And very national specific. So I thought, some bits were, but no, they're funny. And they were hired to broadcast in the language, right, to their respective countries because they wanted to reach those audiences. But they were told that it also needed to sound as British as Yorkshire pudding. So at the beginning it was a little hard, right? Because they were like, it's hard to straddle these borders and stick the right tone, and how can we be British and at the same time interesting to the French and the Italians, etc., etc. But they were, and I think at the beginning their status was complicated because they were still perceived as enemy aliens,
Yeah.
right? They still
Yeah.
came from those countries, so it was a process, but I
And
think they
probably
managed to.
if they wanted to stick around after the war, they had to become anti-communist.
Uh, Probably, yeah. That's also the hard transition afterwards, right? Yes, yes. But I think in their case, especially so, there was this beautiful exhibition at the Musée de l'Art et du Judaïsme de Maïf, is called like this, in Paris, about one of them, Pierre Dac. So one of the Frenchmen who joined this broadcast called Les Français parlent au Français, so the French speak to the French. And it was a comedian. It was really funny, and he continued after the war, which is a sign of success, right? So he continued to come up with satirical sketches. Return to France was popular there. So I think the long-lasting nature of their work is also interesting, and they received. So I was trying. I haven't. I don't have enough information about this, but I wanted to get some audience reports or audience letters, right, to sort of
Right.
assess how popular they were. And they got some thank you letters, thank you letters from people who said, look, you really lifted our spirits, to sort of like provided relief from the situation. So I think this is also a sign of success. And the third sign of success, in the case of this specific Frenchman, Pierre Dac, that I was looking at, is that he really pissed off his counterpart. So the man in charge of Vichy propaganda was Philippe Herriot, and he was targeting him constantly. So there was this back and forth, but Dak was just so much funnier. And then in the end, it's kind of prophetic because Philippe Herriot sort of like criticizing him on air, right, saying you are part of these group of people who left France, right? So how can you claim that you are a patriot, right? You are a traitor because you went away. And he responds and says, actually, you don't know anything about patriots, right? Because you're just serving a collaborationist regime. And he sort of predicts that he's going to be killed by the resistance, right? He's like, if you can make this claim, you'll see that while on my brother's grave, because his brother was unfortunately killed by the Nazis, he was part of the resistance. So he says he's the true patriot, right? So he's gonna have a great recognition, and on yours instead, people will just say, killed by the resistance, but actually somebody who defended the Nazis. And this actually happens. So Henriot he ends up being killed by the resistance. So I thought I was really struck by this exchange because it's kind of prophetic, right? So he's telling him, you think that you're the great patriot now, but you're not gonna stand the test of time.
Did you notice big differences between the resistive humor in the three regimes, whether it's resistive humor from London or resistive humor inside those countries, differences between what was going on in Italy and Germany and France?
So not so much at the moment, in the sense that the differences that I notice are related to the kind of facts and information that they appeal to, right? So it's always very specific. It targets something that's happened. So, for instance, in Mussolini's case, they are joking about the fact that he's painted as this great hero, but he's actually eating a lot and drinking a lot. And so the joke is that, he's gonna drain Italy of its resources. So they appeal to a specific aspect that it's known to the people who are there. In the French case, for instance, they talk about the service du travail obligatoire, so that they were sending men to Germany for this forced labor service, and so saying like, your big claim is that you're freeing everybody. Look how free we are. We're going to Germany because we have to work for them. So you're not deciding anything. You're not even in charge because the Nazis are actually in charge. So it appeals to aspects of life, right? Facts that are happening, things that people would be complaining about and would relate to. But the logic behind is really the same. And same with Germany. So, for instance, Robert Lucas, who was in charge of one of the programs broadcasting to Germany, broadcasting to Austria, invents this character. So he's this Lance Corporal Adolf Hirnschall, made up corporal, who's at the front, and he's writing letters to his wife at home, right? And so he writes these letters, and it's really funny. So I think this probably might be very German or very Austrian, because Robert Lucas is Austrian. But so if you read the letters, they're very matter of fact. So he's not like he's laughing, right? So he's stating things, and this is happening, and then we're doing this. But they're very funny because they're crazy, right? So the things that he presents as absolutely normal are crazy. So, for example, he says, we're here at the front, and we're practicing, I guess, this kind of elastic defense doctrine, and we have never advanced as much as we have retreated this week. So it's going great. So, we are actually retreating, but it's going great because this is what he's supposed to do. So he's stating these things, and then he says, it's great that, so he makes fun of Nazi occultism. He says it's great that, the Nazis are interested in this because there's been a great increase in the spirit world. And so we should take care of those fellas down there. And what he means is that a bunch of soldiers have died, right? And this is on Hitler. And so, Hitler's taking care of this. He's taking care of the spirit world so that he can keep following the poor soldiers who ended up there. So but it sounds like, because they're dry, right? So they're just describing things like the Nazis would do, but it's very funny.
I love this. Can we get on to the first book project now?
Absolutely, yeah.
And espionage. Can I tell you my story about a book I wrote about spies?
Oh, please do.
Fun story. I wrote a book about spying, and I was very late delivering it in terms of the contract. So I finally sent it off to the publisher, and I got an email back saying, "Dear Professor Miller, thank you very much for your book proposal, which will be considered in due course." I said, "Fuck off. I've got a contract. This is what it says. This is the manuscript. Publish it." I got an email back. "I'm really sorry. I'm actually the cleaner, and I'm walking past someone's desk doing all the things that I do in my job, and I saw your email and I thought it might be fun to answer it."
That's amazing. Oh my God.
So this guy was a real spy, and it was pretty funny. That was one of the biggest publishers in the world.
I hope he didn't get fired. My God, they should have kept
I
him
hope so
on.
too. Well, I had my other book story, one of my other books, that was with Oxford. This was with another university press, and this time the book was sent out for copy editing, and it came back with thousands of suggested corrections, none of which were correct English. So I wrote back to the guy saying, I don't think you're alphabetic, and I don't think you're an English speaker, or at least not a native one. He wrote back saying, I really needed a job. I've never read a book.
Oh my
I
God.
applied for this job and I got it. If I don't change anything, will you promise not to tell the press? And I thought, poor bastard. Imagine the hell of reading my stupid scholarly book and then being exposed. So I said, okay. That book is one of the volumes that the Trump administration has banned from people reading. It was in
Oh, wow.
301 books listed by the New York Times as prohibited from circulation at the Naval Academy last
Oh
year.
my God. You
Anyway,
have the most insane stories.
they're pretty well, when you've been around a long time, you collect them, but they're pretty good stories, aren't they? I
They are excellent. So you're confirming a suspicion and thing that colleagues have said that, the business of copy editing is gone downhill big time. Like now have poor people like in India say do it, and it's just not good.
Oh,
So
my
it was
first
it
book
was classy of you
My
to
first
just
book
say
was
fine.
brilliantly copy edited by a magnificent editor who also wrote a really classic book, but nothing like that happens anymore. In any event, much as I love to talk about myself and would go on happily for an hour
I
or
think we should have you on the podcast. Yeah.
let's have some not only mansplaining, but autobiographical mansplaining.
These are cool stories. Yeah.
One of the themes in my book, which is called Spy Screen, is gender and sexuality. This is a big issue in your first project. There are
Mm,
three sections of the project, as I understand.
yeah.
One of
Yeah.
them is about that. And there is this maniacal notion of women not being trustworthy that goes through much of the literature.
Yeah.
I wondered if
Yeah.
you could tell us a bit about that element in your project.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, middle section's gonna be, I would say the subversion of gender norms, right? Because we know how the fascists fought about gender, so women were supposed to be stay-at-home mothers and caretakers. Certainly not on the political stage, right? Certainly not on the political arena. Man was supposed to be virile. So the only man that they could conceive, and here I'm talking both of Hitler and Mussolini, right, that were the embodiment of this kind of man, or at least sold people that they were the embodiment of this kind of man. Now we know that that's really not the case, but uh, strong, masculine man with a woman at his side. So the woman was the sidekick, certainly not at the center. Now, this is the theory, the theory that they broadcast, the theory that they embed in every possible form of propaganda that they put out there. But sometimes theory needs to bend a little, right? We need to adjust it because we have other priorities. And so this was the big discovery. This was what I found extremely interesting in looking at the spies, because when are the spies really useful? This was the big question at the beginning of the project, because of course historians have correctly pointed out that these are very popular dictatorship, right? So they don't really need the spies. They can just terrorize people to do their bidding. They can use denunciations. So, very good work, for instance, by Robert Gillespie about denunciations, how much people love to denounce their neighbors, denounce passerbys, denounce even family members, and send letters about what they were doing. But the risk, if we only emphasize that aspect, is that we're essentially saying that, the dictatorship don't bear any responsibility for this terror and this violence that they perpetrated, right? Because they were so popular that people were just following on their own. Not really. They were putting a lot of thinking into how enforcing terror, right, and enforcing the regimes. And so I think that the spies play a role in that case. And the role is that there are spaces that are hard to infiltrate, right? Because it's hard to reach those spaces, especially when these are spaces occupied by others, quote unquote, right? So people that fall through the cracks of the regimes and don't abide by the law, or do not really follow the regulations of the regime. And of course, all sorts of political opponents are one issue, especially abroad. So especially for the Nazi regime that starts occupying countries and then wants to govern those countries. But this is hard to do when you're outside of Germany. And then, even within the countries, spaces that are occupied by people that they label as non-part of the regime. So in the case of the Nazi regime, there was this whole idea of Volksgemeinschaft, right? So this community, absolutely fake. Of course, we know now, absolutely destructive, but only certain kinds of people could fit in, right? The Aryans and sort of like people that fit a certain description, gay people, sort of like any sort of otherness, queerness, absolutely not. Women at the margins again, at the side of a man. Jewish people absolutely excluded, right? Jewish people needed to be eradicated from the earth for Hitler. So, how to locate these people? Hard to do because while it's really easy to, locate the Jewish people when they're still not worried about being arrested, right? When they're still trying to follow the regulations, when they don't emigrate abroad. In large cities, for example, where the Jewish people go into hiding, it's hard to find them. And so it would come in handy to have a Jewish person that tells you where they are. Gay people, similar case scenarios. So they have their circles, right? How do we infiltrate those circles? We might need to find a gay person who's willing to denounce the other people in the circle. But we cannot. So how do we reconcile? This is what was interesting to me. How do we reconcile this with the narrative that these people should not be part of the regime at all, right? We don't. So we sort of close our eyes a little. We bend the rules a little so long as they serve the regime and they serve the larger purpose. So this was extremely interesting for me. And it was interesting for me to look at some of these cases, right? Some of these, queer people or sort of like Jewish people who unfortunately decided to collaborate with the regime. And of course, again, there are a few cases, they are very specific. And with the women, it was interesting to find that there are only a few women spies and they stand out. It's incredible. And so I have this chapter about some of them because, they are working these gender stereotypes, right? They're taking advantage of them because it's a way to come on top, it's a way to survive in a man-dominated world and in a world that tells you that you are nothing, right? You're just something if you're on the side of a man. And of course, these are not heroes. I have to be very careful about the way I write about these people because these are still spies for the fascist and Nazi regime. So these are still people who are responsible for having people arrested, deported to concentration camps, and killed. But I want to use these cases as a tool to point out this contradiction between theory and practice. I don't know if this was a satisfactory answer. Again, a very convoluted answer, but just trying to give you a sense.
I've read your article in Shoah,
Yeah.
which is a journal, not only a description. And it is very disturbing and heartrending, Jewish spies betraying Jewish folks. And there's this bizarre figure at the center of it who ends up converting to Christianity and then killing herself years after.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quite extraordinary.
Two, actually, it's very interesting. The two stars, the two stellas. So there's the Italian one and there's the German one, and both of them have similar trajectories where once they are, completely rejected by their Jewish community, then they convert. And very, very sad, again, harrowing stories, but such captivating stories, right? And I think with different motivations, because in the case of Celeste di Porto, Stellaria, right, she seems to have this desire to emerge, right, to change her status. So from the very beginning, she's sort of like strategizing how to gain more power, how to come on top. So that's one case. That's a different case. This is why she decides to join, these fascist gangs and work for them. And then unfortunately he's responsible for the death of part of her community in Rome. The other one at the beginning, is sort of trying to save herself, trying to save her family. But then, I think, and you should tell me what you think about this, right? Espionage becomes a practice, right? Somehow when you become involved in it, it's kind of really hard to get out of it. So you're always a spy. You're always thinking that uh, that has become your identity, right? So the identity that was supposed to be a transition, I guess, right? A fake identity that you take on to achieve something ends up becoming your real identity. And so, yes, in the case of Stella Goldschlag, then Stella Kubler-Isaacson, she has like
Mm.
a long stream of husbands. Eh, that becomes their ultimate identity.
And I'm thinking here too of an earlier case you look at, Violet Gibson,
Yeah,
her
yeah,
article, one of a group of would-be assassins seeking to kill Mussolini in the early years of the regime. For all sorts of reasons, she is repatriated out of the country, but ends up in a mental asylum.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
term used for decades. These women paid a heavy price.
They did. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Any thoughts
absolutely. And I
about how?
think.
So I'm wondering if there's an element of gender in that you might pick out for us.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I mean, they paid a heavy price. They already started from a disadvantaged position, right? I think. So I think that uh there was no, so it's really hard to write about these cases because you don't want to be judgmental. Let's put it that way, right? As a historian, you're supposed to be uh, as objective as you can, which is, hard to do sometimes because we're people and we have opinions, right? And we have bias. But to me, it's really striking, right, that there's a gender element. And I think this was striking to me even before because I worked on women in the resistance. And that was a beautiful story to tell, but there are similarities because these are women that are living in the same time, right? So women in the resistance are, joining the resistance, yes, because they're patriots and because they want to, they realize that they're in the position to help. They are skilled, they're brave, but they also want to gain some independence, right? And so join an activity that was not traditional for women, have some sort of political agency. And this is very important, I think, and we see this in many cases. Women who spy are similar, they have this similar mindset. They're seeking this agency that they don't have otherwise, but their results are destructive. So I think that the gender element is very important and there are similarities, but the outcomes are very different. So this is how I was, trying to see the story. And of course, it's just fascinating how then they dominate the narrative of media, newspapers, right? So for instance, in the trial of well, Viola Gibson, of course, is very, very talked about, very discussed, but that's one case. But in the trial of Celeste Di Porto, everybody's on trial. So she's on trial, but the fascist gang that has committed all the crimes, right? The bulk of the crimes is on trial. Guess who everybody cares about? Her, right? She literally relegates everybody else to a footnote because they're all observing this, beautiful, evil woman who's on trial and who doesn't want to apologize for it, right? And so I think that uh, there's a gender element in the choices that they made. There's a gender element in the way they are discussed, right? In the way they are portrayed. And so it's really interesting, but it's also treacherous territory because you have to always pay attention to the words that you're using, right? And always point out when you're borrowing from the sources, because those are not the words that we would use today to describe these cases.
In terms of the other two sections of the book, which are either side of the one about gender and sexuality, it's politics and religion.
Yes.
Could you talk to us a little bit about that? Because in the sort of mythology of today, there's a right and a wrong when it comes to politics on this, even though the alliances between the imperialist pigs of Britain and the totalitarian Stalinists of the Soviet Union, they were still, on the right side of history. In the case of religion, the Vatican not exactly distinguishing itself, but there are revisionist lines about protecting those who could be protected and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about this espionage issue in terms of capital P politics and capital R religion?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so politics section was the most straightforward because, of course, I arrived at this from the resistance standpoint, right? So I was looking at the resistance, I was interviewing resistance members, and some of them said we were arrested because of these spies. So this is how the whole story started. And so I was like, spies? Wow, cool. Let's go look for these people. And so I started this in France, went to the archives, and it was tricky because the files were still restricted. So you had to apply for this, very lengthy process called dérogation. So to ask for permission to see one of these files, and it took forever. And so I'm like, I mean, it's really captivating, but I don't think I'm gonna be able to do this for the PhD until François Hollande, the then French president, pestered by demands of historians who were like, this is too long, this is very French, can you make this a little less French? Can we see these files? The war is over, etc., etc. Said, fine, let's open that up for consultation. So then it was a treasure trove, right? Because suddenly all these court trials could be read. And it was fascinating because I was trying to understand why, again, they would use these spies, right? Why couldn't they just use the regular army, right? The regular police, etc., etc. And again, the mindset is that they're trying to infiltrate networks of political opponents. And so they need the information, they need to locate them, but they also need to put a dent into this idea that the resistance is cohesive, right? There's this myth of the resistance, right? We're all on the side of the resistance. No, because not only they're infiltrating the networks, but they're also trying to turn resistance members. And so I have two separate chapters, because the first chapters is the professional spies, right? So the spies who pose as resistance members and are, professionally infiltrating these resistance networks because that's their job and they're heavily remunerated for it, right? There's a whole, uh, they're paid, but they're also given material privileges, right? So, house, car, means, things. Um, but the second chapter is treason, right? So the whole meaning of treason, what it means to catch, arrest one of these resistance members and then, subject this person to torture and see whether the person turns and then, use this to say, actually, you're all traitors. So the resistance is not really just heroes who are like-minded, and have the same political allegiance. So this was how I was thinking about it. And I think it was interesting to do this in France because they have these long debated cases like René Hardy, who's that resistance member who's accused of betraying Jean Moulin, big hero of the French resistance, right? And up to today, if you go into a conference or a lecture hall where somebody's lecturing on the topic, you might have very heated discussions. Somebody in the audience who stands up and says, no, he was not a traitor. And somebody else who says, actually, yes, he was a traitor because I've examined the files and this is what I worked out from them. So, I don't want to say for some of these cases, one way or the other. I just present the facts. I say, this is really interesting the way it is. I'm not gonna put somebody on trial for the third time, to try and work out an answer. But is just the debate that's interesting. Is really the fact that this myth, right, of the resistance was challenged this way, and I think in an effective way. Religion is another story, right? So subverting your religious community, I think it's an interesting tool because we go to religion. I guess it's the last resort, right? It's a little like humor, right? It's when we're devoid of all other forms of resistance, we resort to religion or we resort to humor, something inside, right? Faith. And Dom priests make the best spies. They're just there, right? You go there and you confess all your crimes and your issues, and suddenly they know everything. And so this started because I was again interviewing one resistance member who told me that she was arrested because of a spy, and the spy in question was Robert Alèche, this priest who, during the day staunch anti-Nazi supporter, giving sermons against the Nazis at night, living with two mistresses in the Rue Spontigny in Paris, and working full time for the Gestapo. So, again, I'm surprised by how skilled they were, because I think, they were, again, at a risk of being arrested, and they were, you know, uh, quite effective in convincing people that they were reliable, I guess. Again, I think a priest occupies an excellent position in order to gather information. So I looked at him, I looked at other cases, and then in the Italian case, I looked at a more structural infiltration of the Vatican, which ties into one of the women I looked at, because Bice Pupeschi, who's the Italian case that I've looked at, was in charge of an army of sub-informers. So there were spies working for her. She was the lover of the police chief, right? So again, gender element plays a big role in here, and she had much more agency that somebody else would have had because of this. But she comes up with this brilliant idea. She's like, I should hire some high-ranking prelates within the Vatican to give me information, and she's successful. So she, gains a lot of knowledge that way. And I think, uh, these are interesting cases. I think I'm always trying to get at the motivations, right? So I was also interested in finding out why they would do it. And I think, again, money plays a big role, right? The fact that they were remunerated plays a big role. But again, it complicates this whole idea of the relationship between fascism and the church, right? Because sometimes we say that fascism is not as achieved of a totalitarianism. It's not like Nazi Germany, right? Because Mussolini had to fight two competing powers, and one was the church and the other one was the king. So there was a monarchy, right, which Hitler didn't have to deal with. And then there was the church, the institutionalized church, right, the Vatican. And yet we discovered that there were spies within the Vatican, right? So even if they did the Patti Lateranensi, right, the agreement, and they tried to get along, things weren't as clear cut as they appear. So yes, again, politics and religion, I think, are two very interesting layers to look at.
Well, Prof, thank you very much for being so generous with your time. To wind things up, I'd like to invite you to add anything you wish. That might be something entirely new that we haven't discussed, or it could be terrain we've covered.
Oh gosh, that's fascinating. What can I add? Well, I think we can maybe go back to humor. So I'm currently editing a volume about laughter as a coping mechanism. Maybe this is a fun note to end, right? Is humor a coping mechanism? Is it for us all? So I think we're trying to do this. We did a conference at Durham University on the topic, and now we are working on the edited volume. And it's fascinating to see how this applies to so many walks of life, right? To so many different contexts. And we even have a section of humor in extremis, where scholars look at Ukraine, for example, and scholars look at Texas death row. So inmates on Texas death row using humor as a coping mechanism. So, something to think about, I guess, right? For our difficult and complicated times.
These are amazing questions you're looking at in both the book projects. Whether they're copy edited well or not, I'm sure there'll be terrific contributions.
I hope so.
And I very much appreciate the time you've given to be with us today.
And thank you so much for inviting me. I really like talking to you. Again, I think if you're ever the subject of the podcast, I will be very interested to listen, because it sounds like you're doing fabulous work as well.